Hi, I'm Jeffrey Smith, and I had the pleasure and honor of being a presenter in Beijing during the July 25th and 6th conference, where there were some of the top experts in the world on GMOs. And my job was to summarize. So during the presentations for 2 days, I had their PowerPoints on my computer, and I would go through as they were going through and pick out the best stuff, and sometimes even change the slides. So some things I would take off, some things I would combine on the same slides. So these slides you're about to see are not necessarily the original ones, but they're representative of the original ones. And I'm going to go through, and I did the whole thing in 19 minutes, 100 slides. And I'm going to take more time now because everyone in the audience had already seen the slides. And so what I was doing was pointing out relationships and patterns that had emerged over time that really told a very powerful story. What I'll do now is I'll spend a little more time elaborating on the information as well as describing these patterns. And I'll also introduce each speaker, which I didn't do in Beijing. The attendees included genetic researchers, university professors, medical doctors, veterinarians, etc., with over 300 participants and simultaneous translation. And they included participants from several government departments, including 2 prominent generals. The first person to speak was Dr. Hans Herren. Now, Hans Herren is not only president of the Millennium Institute, he was co-chair of the ISTAD report, which was the most comprehensive evaluation of agriculture ever done, and it was sponsored by the United Nations and the World Bank and half a dozen or dozen other international organizations, signed on by 59 countries, and it found that GMOs in their current state have nothing to offer to feed the hungry world, eradicate poverty, or create a sustainable agriculture. He is also a recipient of the World Food Prize, before it was basically hijacked by the biotech industry. And his overview was about agriculture in general, setting the stage, concluding that there's too little diversity with unsustainable consumption patterns, and there was overfeeding, problems with food prices, too much production, too much waste, greenhouse gases. And his conclusion was the same conclusion drawn by the ISTAD report, agroecology, with an all-inclusive paradigm shift. Then Dr. Mei-Wan Ho spoke, and she is a PhD in biochemistry, and she is a prolific writer not only on GMOs, but in integrating current state-of-the-art thinking and challenging old, stale paradigms, which she did brilliantly in Beijing by pointing out that the central dogma of one gene producing one protein, producing one trait, is not only wrong, but it is so obsolete that actually the flow is in every direction. The environment, the internal environment, the genome, they all interact in what she calls the fluid genome. And that the unexpected changes that occur in the DNA, that's just the process of genetic engineering itself, creates enormous capacity for harm in this new model, and that the evaluation of the things that can go wrong is completely missing. So she talks about scrambling the host genome, widespread mutations, inactivating genes, activating genes, creating new RNAs that are problems, new proteins that are problems, new metabolites that are problems, activating dormant viruses. So this is the generic process of genetic engineering, whether you're doing a soy bean that's herbicide tolerant or golden rice that's supposed to correct vitamin A. So you may correct vitamin A and at the same time create massive damage in the DNA and all of the other aspects of the plant, which could have considerably more damage than what you're trying to fix. Dr. Eva Sirinath Singh also works with Mei-Wan Ho. She gave a brilliant presentation on RNAi, interference RNA, in GM crops. Now, the browning apple or the non-browning apple, the papaya, the viral-resistant products, these use RNA as regulators of genetic engineering. And double-stranded RNA in particular is one way that RNA controls and regulates genes. Now, RNA used to just be thought of as a way station between DNA and proteins. Now they realize RNA can impact and regulate gene expression. So they gave RNA to a mouse, and it changed the regulatory output. It changed the protein production in the liver of the mouse. And the changes are also sometimes inheritable. So you inherit not just what's happening in the DNA, but also the RNA. There was a study with bees where they exposed the bees to an RNA, double-stranded RNA, which they thought would be a control group. It altered 1,100 genes expression. So Monsanto wants the new generation of GMOs to be using the RNA technology and have been trying to suppress the evidence that this technology is probably far more dangerous than the current generation of GMOs. And that RNA actually may be, it's true according to many, that may be as important as vitamins and minerals, etc., in the foods that we eat, because we're not just getting the vitamins and minerals from the plants, they're actually helping our DNA figure out how it's to be expressed. So I went a little bit beyond Dr. Eva's talk in describing the RNA, so this was part of what she talked about. Now, another problem that's generic, RNA is always involved in genetic engineering because you alter the DNA, which alters the RNA, which alters the protein. So whether you're trying to use double-stranded RNA or you're just creating something where you're forgetting about the RNA and still just trying to do the proteins, the RNA is affected and might cause problems that they're not even looking for. Another generic problem with GMOs is that genes may transfer to gut bacteria or into our own DNA. And this was actually a finding in 2004 in Nature Biotechnology, where the only human feeding study ever conducted on a currently commercialized GMO found that part of the transgene that makes Roundup Ready soybeans Roundup Ready, bacterial gene, transferred into gut bacteria. And that gut bacteria was not killable with glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, suggesting but not yet proving that once it transferred, it continued to function, causing Roundup Ready gut bacteria. Now, foreign genes, it turns out, are found in the cells of different organs and of animals and humans regularly. So it used to be thought that genes were destroyed during digestion. Now we know that genes, whether DNA or not, are found in organs, blood, etc. And this presents another generic potential disaster. They found in the only place that looked at it, which was ironically in China, they found antibiotic-resistant marker genes, which are used during the process of genetic engineering. You shoot the genes into a plate of cells, you don't know which of the cells got the gene inserted, so you douse it with antibiotics that normally kill the cell. But because the gene construct that you put in has an antibiotic-resistant marker gene, if it gets in there and if it functions, it means that gene is now conferring antibiotic resistance to that cell. So when they pour antibiotics on all those cells, the ones that survive, those are the ones where the gene construct made it into the DNA. So it's only used to figure out which of the cells ended up taking the insertion gene. But it might transfer to gut bacteria, it might transfer to other things, causing antibiotic resistance, which is already responsible for deaths, amputations, etc. They found these genes in rivers, 6 rivers in China, even though they weren't supposed to be planting some of the GMOs that had these genes associated with it. Now, Dr. Mei-Wan Ho, by the way, these are not in the order necessarily of how people presented, because in mixing and matching, I took things out based on the patterns that I'm going to highlight. She points out that in laboratory settings, so many things have been found to go wrong when evaluating GMOs either on the market or experimental ones. I'll just look at this with you. Stunting, death, sterility, allergies, death, liver toxicity, lung inflammation, food sensitivity, organ damage, illnesses and deaths, etc. Now, this is one level of investigation and evidence, laboratory animal feeding studies. And this is one of the bedrock levels that was looked at throughout the conference, but there was more. Within that, we sometimes heard evidence and we sometimes saw evidence. And here's evidence from Irina Ermakova of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who was also there. She fed genetically modified soy to rats, and the livers on the right are gnarly, that's the technical term, and that's the GM-fed rats' livers compared to the other ones on the left. Now, the second level of investigation is what's happening on the farm. So we see what's happening with laboratory animals. Ib Pedersen from Denmark gave a brilliant summary of what's been happening on his pig farm, and he has 600 or so sows. And when he shifted from GM soy to non-GM soy, there was a dramatic change in many, many parameters of health, including here a 2/3 drop in antibiotic use, matched or graphed against the national average. He started out above the national average and ended up below national average, showing in his chart the reduction in use over the year of non-GMO soy. He also described higher milk production. Sows could have 1 to 2 more piglets at the udder, less medicine use, less abortions, more piglets per litter, no diarrhea in piglets, and in weaners that change to feed containing more soy, no bloat or ulcers. He had actually had to deal with death from bloat or ulcers, 36 deaths in the previous 2 years. The sows lived longer, and their production level in terms of offspring dropped after 8 birth cycles rather than 6. So a dramatic change in his farm, switching just GM soy to non-GM soy. Now, Art Dunham didn't have to look at just one farm because he's a veterinarian in Iowa. So he looks at lots and lots of different farms, and he has seen changes. He's been working on animals for 40 years, over 40 years. So he was around when GMOs were introduced, so he can compare the before and after. And he talked about atrophied testicles, huge teats and mastitis on bulls, prolapse prepuces, blood and mucus and manure, non-responsive pneumonia, and wasting from what he's seen in direct response to GMO feed. And Howard Vlieger, who was part of a study with pigs, reported something that I had never heard about, and that is that the animals were irritable and had difficulty performing simple tasks and were listless in lack of contentment. Now, I have heard from many, many farmers and veterinarians talking about the improvements in the health of animals, and I believe every one of them used a very technical term when describing their animals as more happy. And this is an interesting thing from this anecdotal concerns from the study done in Iowa. Now, Gottfried Glockner had contracted with Syngenta to be a trial site to feed his cows Syngenta's BT-176 corn. And Syngenta never told him that in a previous trial, cows had died after eating the corn. And unfortunately, Gottfried had serious health problems with his cows. White, gray, sticky diarrhea, water accumulation in the joints, udder edema, blood vessel enlargement, blood in the milk, dry, brittle udder, and the teat and skin. The cow mouth was light and pink, very susceptible to illness, unusually high number of deaths, abnormality with the animals. And he ended up losing all of his cows. Zen Honeycutt from Moms Across America introduces the next level of evidence. We've seen lab animals, we've seen livestock, and now we see human testimony. So her organization has been collecting testimony primarily from moms And here's an example. My son had severe autism as a single mom who makes about $40,000. It's tough, but we only eat organic because I found out about GMOs 2 years ago. When we went organic about 2 weeks later, my father thought I was giving my son a new drug because he saw such improvements. I said, nope, he just went organic. This year he entered high school and not one of his teachers could tell. He used to have severe autism symptoms. He is with a regular class and he's doing well. Another person, I went GMO free, and after about a month, my fibromyalgia symptoms went away. I happen to hear more of these symptoms than perhaps anyone in the world. And I've interviewed audiences at 100 events, and the most popular symptoms that improve are gastrointestinal, followed by a number of them: immune system issues, skin problems, headache, fatigue, and brain fog is very big. And then there's many, many others that are less popular. So the next level of evidence is broad-scale comparison of trends in disease. And if you look at the autism prevalence in 6-year-olds in the United States, and you track it with the exposure to glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, you see an amazingly tight correlation of the slope. I've seen about 20 different graphs of diseases in the United States with this type of relationship, either to glyphosate or to Bt corn or to GMOs in general, etc. So here this was the themes that I brought out in the conference, that we have very similar patterns in lab animals, livestock, humans, and then large-scale epidemiological evaluations. Here's dementia and autism. This is deaths from senile dementia. And again, look at the tight correlation with glyphosate or Roundup application. Zhao Zui is a researcher in Beijing. He looked at the health hazard of GMO soy cooking oil, and there was significant increase in certain diseases since the GMO cooking oil was imported from the US. Heart patients, imagine having a country with more than 200 million people with heart patients. Cancers of every type diagnosed in 10,000 people every day, 50 million infertile families, about 70% of patients with all kinds of stomach trouble, accounting for 70% of the population. And he described how that increased dramatically since the GMO cooking oil, which means exposure to glyphosate, because they did find glyphosate residues in cooking oil from GMOs. Now, as we all know here, there's two primary traits for GMO. There's herbicide tolerance. The premier herbicide-tolerant crop is Roundup ready. Means it can be sprayed with Roundup and not die. And there's also Bt toxin, which is produced as an internal insecticide, which breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them. Now, if we look at just the corn, if we look at the Bt corn, that was a situation where we found in the pregnant women's blood tested in Canada, 93% had Bt toxin in their blood, 80% in their unborn fetuses, and about 69% in non-pregnant women. So they also found in another study that the Bt toxin pokes holes in human cells, not just in insects to kill them, but if it pokes holes in human cells, maybe it's creating holes in the walls of the cells in the intestines, and that's how it got into the blood. Judy Carman had worked with Howard Vlieger. She's a PhD in medicine and has several degrees and has been working on GMO research. She's brilliant, and she writes for the Australian Public Health Association, etc. She conducted a study with Howard Vlieger in western Iowa that showed significant inflammation in the stomach, 2.6 times more likely for the GM-fed pigs. In males, that was 4 times more likely. In females, 2.2 times more likely. And you can see this is a drug-free, non-GMO-fed pig stomach compared to a drug-free, GMO-fed pig stomach. You could see ulcers and inflammation in there. That was from Howard Vlieger's photos when he did this in a slaughterhouse on his own. Similar results in their study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And what is the cause? Well, Dr. Carman pointed out that Bt proteins specifically are designed to rupture the gut of insects, and the GM maize that was used in this study, they used both corn and soy, contained 2 Bt proteins that may have acted synergistically, causing similar disruption in the guts of the pigs. Now, a lot of attention was given during the conference to Roundup, including just its active ingredient, glyphosate. Roundup is a broad-spectrum antibiotic. It chelates or binds with nutrients, making them unavailable biologically. It also can mess up the DNA and also cause disruption of hormones. Now, on hand to discuss Roundup, among others, was Dr. Don Huber, who's an expert at Roundup, used to work as a consultant for Monsanto, plant pathologist, a professor emeritus in plant pathology at Purdue University. Dr. Stephanie Seneff from MIT. She and co-author Anthony Sampson have done 2 amazing studies, review studies on glyphosate, linking it to numerous diseases, some of which we'll talk about. Michael Antonio, who is a genetic engineer, does human gene therapy and research, and has come out strongly against using GMOs in food because he knows enough to know that his technology that he uses for humans is not ready for prime time in food or released outdoors. All 3 focused on Roundup and found that one thing I did not know this before, glyphosate downregulates 291 enzymes. Enzymes are needed for metabolic pathway action. It stimulates pathogens in the soil. It's toxic to beneficial microorganisms. It's persistent in the soil. It promotes mycotoxins in crop, straw, etc. It's linked to colony collapse disorder. It promotes infertility and miscarriage, and it blocks efficient water use and photosynthesis. It chelates many, many different minerals, and many of these are essential for important health pathways. Monica Kruger, a veterinarian and bacteriologist from Germany, had done some research on Roundup and found that the trace elements in cow tissue had been chelated and made unavailable to the animals. So animals largely eat Roundup-ready crops with Roundup residue, so they're not getting active minerals, and the residue, when it enters their body, may further chelate the minerals that are already there, making them mineral deficient. Now, there's been chronic botulism from the mid-1990s rising in Germany, and this is one thing that Monica Kruger has evaluated. Botulism comes from Clostridium botulinum, a common bacteria that's essentially everywhere. But it is controlled by another bacterium which is sensitive, meaning it gets killed by glyphosate. So when the cows eat the Roundup, the controlling bacteria is largely killed off. The botulinum can increase, which might explain the chronic botulism poisoning in the animals, and chronic botulism in humans is not pretty either. Now, that's with gut bacteria changes, but gut bacteria can be changed in a lot of ways by glyphosate, which is a patented antibiotic. It kills the beneficial ones, the lactobacillus, the bifidobacteria, the stuff we pay for, but not the botulinum, the E. coli, the salmonella. And it can cause damage to the gut bacteria, which is linked to food allergies, colitis, irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, and more. Food allergies have increased 400% in the United States among children. Could be related to the gut bacteria being damaged by Roundup. And the damaged gut in general, this is again the #1 response that I get from 100 different events with thousands of people is gastrointestinal disorders. If there's a damaged gut bacteria uses a pathway, it's called the shikimate pathway, to produce aromatic amino acids, including L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, which regulates insulin and therefore diabetes. So if we don't have enough tryptophan, we may not have enough serotonin, which might link to diabetes. Serotonin, of course, is also linked to behavior and mood and tells the body, I'm full, I've eaten enough. There's food intolerances that are on the rise. Again, here we are now looking at the epidemiological statistics. We see the animal feeding studies with Roundup. We see changes on the farm, and now we're looking at it from a national level. Food intolerances in the United States, 24.7 million children. Colitis tripled in 10 years. Crohn's, 79% increase in the diagnosis of children. So if GMOs cause these things, this would be consistent with that. Now we get back to the farm. Ib Pedersen, actually no, this one is Gottfried Glockner. His animals had massive diarrhea symptoms within 12 hours after grass consumption, where the residues of the corn had been spread, the silage, etc. Now we turn to cancer. Irina Ermakova showed a rather horrific video of these animals walking around with enormous tumors. And these animals have been fed genetically modified soy. The Seralini study, 3 animals from 3 different experimental groups. Seralini was not there, but one of his colleagues was there, shared some of this information. And this group on the left were rats that were fed Roundup-ready corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup. Then there was Roundup-ready corn that had been sprayed with Roundup in the middle. Then there was Roundup without the corn at the end. All 3 had multiple massive tumors. They also died earlier and had organ damage in the liver, kidneys, and pituitary. Also presenting was Nicolas Defrange, a member of the Seralini team, who discussed this research, as well as conflicts of interest, confidentiality, and censorship in health risk assessments of GMOs. Now, if you look at the properties of Roundup, it has the properties to promote human breast cancer cell growth at parts per trillion. So here we have the support of the theoretical evidence, the biochemical evidence supporting what we see in lab animals. And then tragic stories from Dr. Medardo Avila Vasquez, a pediatrician and neonatologist from Argentina, who talks about the increased cancer in Argentina in those areas with high pesticide use, with Roundup in particular. And if you look at the increase in cancer, it is horrific. Gastric and testicular cancer up 3 times, liver cancer 9 times, pancreatic cancer 2 times. From 2001 to 2003, they had 67 cancer patients in the same area with lots of spraying. It went to 173 cancer patients, an increase of about 260%. And in China, various cancers were 220 million per year in 2010, up to 350 million in 2012. That jump is amazing. Rapid growth of 59%. If we saw what was happening in China, also reported by a Chinese reporter, there was, in areas where pigs were exposed to a certain genetically modified corn, first of all, they lost field mice. The field mice started to disappear. The pigs started having smaller litters and more birth defects. Now, speaking of fertility, in the US, they found side effects with sows. Open rate means unable to get pregnant, 30 to 70% with BT corn. In South Dakota, reduction of litter averages and smaller birth weights. In Iowa, pseudopregnancies. So on the farm in the US, they also saw significant reproductive disorders at that level. And then in Denmark, significantly less pigs were born after high levels of glyphosate in the food. He had very clear samples taken of every food he used, and the number of pigs born, the litter size and conception rate varied based exactly on how much glyphosate was in the food. I'm sorry about some of these very tragic photos. Here's a picture of a destroyed birth in Gottfried Glockner's farm, his cows became sterile or had strange, unusual pregnancies. And then the miscarriages and malformed fetuses in Argentina. So compared to an area that was not exposed to spray, they had abortions of 3% in 5 years, whereas in areas that had lots of spray, 21%, 19%, 23% in that same period of time. And then if we look at the national average in the US, 30% failure to conceive rate in young couples, the highest in recorded history. 2 million babies lost each year, 379 per day, 3.8 babies per minute in miscarriages. Infertility can also be explained in terms of sperm mobility, because that depends on manganese. Manganese is chelated by glyphosate at high levels. They find with certain animal stillborns, etc., no detectable manganese in the liver. Even though there's supposed to be plenty of manganese in the feed, the Roundup apparently binds with it and makes it completely unavailable, and they end up with reproductive disorders because of the manganese. Dr. Don Huber talked about a new organism. He called it a prion-like organism, or prion-like protein. You can see it on the left compared to the size of bacteria, and also see it on the right. It was in high concentrations in the aborted fetal tissues of ranches and farms that had very high infertility rate and miscarriage rate, also found in aborted fetal tissue in humans, and is highly linked to use of Roundup. It was the Roundup sprayed feed that had these organisms, and when they switched to non-Roundup sprayed feed, the organisms went down both in the feed, and also the conception rate changed dramatically, the fertility rate improved. Dr. Irina Ermakova, senior researcher at the Russian Academy of Sciences, she gave us this amazing study in 2005 where feeding genetically modified soy to female rats starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant, their offspring ultimately were sterile. And the infant mortality rate was over 50% compared to just 10% when mother rats ate non-GMO soy for the same period of time. And the babies were smaller on average. Here's an example of the difference in how they looked. Clear differences in their physiology. Traditional soy on the top, GM soy on the bottom. She also fed GM soy to male rats and noticed the testicles changed from pink to blue, and you can see the cells in their different composition and blood flow below the testicles. So again, this is reproductive disorders that we see on the human level, livestock, and in the lab. Uterus weight in pigs fed GM. In the Iowa study that we talked about earlier with the stomach issue, the uterus was set 25% higher, heavier. In Russia, there was also a study with hamsters where they fed GM soy to hamsters for 3 generations, and by the 3rd generation, most were sterile. Many had hair growing in their mouths as a significant birth defect, and the infant mortality rate was 4 or 5 times the controls. In the United States, we're number 1 for infant deaths on day 1. We have 50% more infants who die on the first day of life than all the industrialized nations combined. It raises the question, how and to what extent are GMOs related to that? One of the capacities for harm is quite tragic in that we now know that what a mother eats during pregnancy or possibly before can affect the health of her baby and her grandchild and her great-grandchild through epigenetics. And when changes occur in genetic engineering, like we saw all the possible changes in the DNA and the RNA and the proteins and other levels, we're playing dice with future generations. One of the other aspects of Roundup is clear evidence of birth defects, and this was a major report study released at the Environmental Analytical Toxicology in, I believe, 2012, yes, showing that Roundup, in the experimental evidence even presented to governments, showed high levels of birth defects. And then if you look at a study done in Argentina, they found similar malformations in chicken and frog embryos at doses way below that used in agriculture. On the farm in Denmark, it found enormous varieties of birth defects until he switched to non-GMO, low glyphosate or no glyphosate feed. And these are just some of the pictures of the pigs that he presented in China. And then we're going to get to the human ones. It was interesting, during the presentation, a study came out on the second day. He and Monica Kruger presented on day one. On the second day, their study was published in a peer-reviewed journal. He had sent the tissues of the deformed pigs to her in Germany, and she found glyphosate in their organs. And the spinal deformities per thousand born in relation to glyphosate, he was able to compare the connection between glyphosate in the food and the deformities in the study, because he had very, very exact data that she was able to analyze. Then there's the human birth defects. Sorry about these pictures. In Argentina. Very, very serious. 12 birth defects out of 200 in one city. And then if you look at the changes over time, from 46 defects in 97 to 60 in 2001 to 186 in 2008. And the congenital anomalies, you can see the graphs there, are related to the geography where the spray of Roundup on soy areas is high. We also looked not as much at the environmental impacts of GMOs, the negative influence on insects, for example, monarch larvae, caterpillars, etc. And we saw in Argentina a deforestation as a result of the GMOs. So it was also causing loss of biodiversity, taking this beautiful biodiverse area and turning it into fields. In Denmark, the pigs that were switched to non-GMO showed a clear economic advantage. So even though IB was paying more for non-GMO soy, he was making $112 extra per sow, or $50,000 per year. And I asked him, what is that in terms of a percentage? He says, you know, sometimes in a year you don't make much money, so 50,000 could be all you make if that's the extra amount. So the impact on farming could be huge with these kind of numbers. Howard Vliger is the Western Iowa farmer who has been doing research on GMOs. He's an excellent speaker. And Bob Streit is an agronomist, and he's among the research team of independent farmers and experts that are looking at some of these problems. And they described what was happening in the U.S. on the farms. This man is 6 feet 4 inches tall. Look at the weeds around him. Herbicide-tolerant crops, herbicide-tolerant weeds. The weeds have outsmarted Monsanto. And the Roundup promotes more than 40 plant diseases that are soil-borne because it promotes fungal growth and it kills the beneficial microorganisms. And Bob Streit pointed out that Goss's wilt, which is usually for years and decades, was just contained within a few counties in the Midwest, I think eastern Nebraska, has now wiped out huge amounts of dollar figures throughout the Midwest, and it is promoted by the use of Roundup and the surfactant, not just the glyphosate, but the surfactant, which drives it into the leaves of the plants. If you look at non-GMO corn on the left and Roundup-ready corn on the right, you can see dramatic differences in the beautiful green color on the left and the sickly green, light green and yellowish corn on the right. And this is because the GM crops do not fare as well, especially in times of drought. They require more water. Sudden death syndrome is wiping out a lot of profits in soy, again, promoted by glyphosate. And you could see aerial fields where that's supposed to be all green. And if you look at soybeans sprayed right next to each other, those sprayed twice on the left and not at all on the right, you can see the sickly plants on the left and the green lush soybeans on the right, times of severe drought. They also found in side-by-side, Howard Vlieger did side-by-side growing on his farm of GM corn versus non-GM corn. The net loss profit from GM corn was about $58 per acre. Now, unfortunately, the colonialization that's occurred of the South is also occurring as biocolonialization, pointed out by one of the guests from South America, how they're taking over and grabbing the resources throughout South America. They're knocking down homes, deforesting, and creating basically soy monocultures with Roundup that are devoid of insects and other plants and birds and wildlife. Peter Saunders, who's a professor at King's College, he described the takeover of the messaging by the biotech industry. They have created something called the Science Media Center and basically want to create an approval system for appropriate evaluation and reporting on on agriculture in general, so that the real information never gets out. There was also a condemnation of the safety assessments. For example, by Judy Carman, she looked at 28 crop safety assessments by the Food Standards Authority of Australia and New Zealand, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. Animals not fed enough for long enough for adverse effects to develop, number of animals too low, often only body weights and death rates are collected, organs were rarely inspected, no blood biochemistry, adverse findings were ignored. One of the things that they ignore are the low-dose effects of Roundup and other chemicals. So they'll look at just the glyphosate and ignore the Roundup formulation. The Roundup formulation is as much as 1,000 times more toxic than the glyphosate supposedly active ingredient. And there's other active ingredients that are not called active ingredients that can be 10,000 times more toxic than glyphosate. Those are ignored. They just look at the active ingredient. Then they ignore the decade of knowledge that extremely low doses of chemicals can have a higher impact on the endocrine system than higher doses. But they ignore that well-established science. And so this curve here shows a very high toxicity with very tiny amounts. Then that goes down, and the impact goes down as you increase the amount of the chemical. And then it goes up again. So the EPA puts a line right in the middle at the bottom and forgets the earlier parts, ignores the low-dose endocrine disruption, assumes it's all a linear relationship, and exposes the entire population to things that might be wreaking havoc with our hormonal system. Now, in addition to poor regulatory requirements, the companies doing the GMO research use incorrect technologies, short period of testing, ignorance about intergenerational effects, and the entire scheme of their feeding studies is usually designed to avoid finding problems. The conclusion by at least this presenter, but essentially by the entire panel, was all GM crops should undergo long-term safety testing on animals physiologically compared to humans by independent researchers before a crop is commercialized, including crops containing stacked genes, meaning multiple genes, because right now, if one gene is approved and another gene is approved, you can put them together in the same crop, and they say, well, since they were approved individually, we can approve them together, which carries no scientific support. The conclusion presented by the delegation from Russia and appreciated by all was to ban the cultivation and usage of GMOs while we're still trying to find out the truth. And this is the delegation from Russia, and they reported that they had banned GMOs cultivation in Russia and were labeling GMOs and were preparing to ban the use of GMOs in baby food. So a lot of progress has been made in Russia. They also pointed out one thing that I've been writing about for years, and that is eyewitness reports show that animals, when given a choice, avoid GMOs. Not every time, but so many times we consider it to be a predicted result. Here, a farmer wanted to test GM corn on squirrel preference because one of his neighbors found that the squirrels wouldn't eat the GM corn. He put 2 bags in his workshop. The mice did the study for him. Broke into the non-GMO corn and finished it, never touched the GM corn. I have one of each of these cobs. Vandana Shiva, who gave the final keynote, shared a video, a very moving video, which is now available on YouTube, of widows and others talking about the suicides among the farmers that had planted Bt cotton. It's highly variable. It doesn't always perform well. Sometimes it fails completely. And yet the farmers were convinced to take out high-interest loans from the secondary market, where interest rates can be as high as 7% per month. Unable to pay back the loans, they face the shame of losing the farms that have been in their families for generations. And the number of suicides over the last 10 years, specifically related to Bt cotton, is 250,000. The chief researcher, Institute of Botany, presented as well. We had information from another director of the Institute for Ecological Research. I'm not going to try and say their names because I would mutate them. Claire Bleakley from New Zealand described the information about the genetically modified livestock in New Zealand and the horrific birth defects and problems that they experienced. Really horrible stuff. And how the researchers tried to hide the evidence of genes transferring from their decaying bodies that were buried into gut bacteria. They buried these animals maybe 10 feet down, and then when they were asked to check to see if there was any transfer to soil bacteria, they scooped some off the top that had been, 6 or 10 feet away from where the animals were buried. Roberto Ugas from Peru, this university, he and others talked about the positive changes that are occurring through local cooperation in different areas. Henry Rowland, who's director of Sustainable Pulse, described many positive things happening in Europe as well. And Anna Broccoli described the positive things also happening in Argentina, as well as this chairman of the Association of Development for Argentina, Miguel Angel Fernandez, and Liliana Maldonado, farmer, and Arnaud talked about the whole resistance that happened in Europe and the history of that. And we also heard from my friend from the Green Formosa Front in Taiwan. And together, at the end of the 2 days, they gave us tremendous hope. They described the movement towards non-GMO, both in food, feed, and regions, GM-free regions and preferences for consumers. They talked about the rise of public action against GMOs on all of these continents. And one presenter from China showed that his corn, which was non-GMO, way outperformed in size, shape, and quantity the GMO from Germany that had been planted in China. Brendan Hoare from Organic Systems in New Zealand talked about the systems approach to how we can take this new model of organic systems and bring it throughout society. And the friends from Argentina and Peru described the effects and the benefits of bringing the groups together for farmers markets and value-added work of the agricultural materials, etc., so that they could take back local food systems. all over South America. And there was a great reverence, of course, for the seeds. And we realized that we were not only representing the humans on the planet, and the livestock, and the gut bacteria, but also the seeds of all generations that had been kept precious and a treasure in the indigenous cultures, because that is truly what they are. And then I mentioned to the group that Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, is now available in Chinese on Amazon.com. So that was the summary, and in a longer form, that I presented in Beijing to an audience that was able to appreciate this vast overlapping levels of supporting dangers. From the theoretical evidence that, say, Roundup causes birth defects, to the laboratory elements, to the livestock, to what's happening in humans. So they walked away not only with a conviction that GMOs needed to be banned and should never have been introduced, but they are probably a major contributor to a lot of the disease and suffering that we're currently facing on the planet. Thank you very much.